The relentless drive by the fossil fuel industry for profits is destroying the ecosystem, threatening the very viability of the human species. And no mechanisms to institute genuine reform or halt the corporate assault are left within the structures of power which have surrendered to corporate control. The citizen has become irrelevant. He or she can participate in heavily choreographed elections, but the demands of corporations and banks are paramount. History has amply demonstrated that the seizure of power by a tiny cabal, whether a political party or a clique of oligarchs, leads to despotism. Governments then cater exclusively to a narrow interest group and redirect the machinery of state to furthering the interests of that group, are no longer capable of responding rationally in times of crisis. Blindly serving their masters, they acquiesce to the looting of state treasuries to bail out corrupt financial houses and banks, while ignoring chronic unemployment and underemployment, along with stagnant or declining wages, crippling debt peonage, a collapsing infrastructure, and the millions left destitute and sometimes homeless by deceptive mortgages and foreclosures. A bankrupt liberal class holding up values it does nothing to defend, discredits itself, as well as the purported liberal values of a civil democracy, as it is swept aside along with those values. In this moment of political, economic, or natural disaster, in short, a crisis, will ignite unrest, lead to instability, and see the state carry out draconian forms of repression to maintain order. This is what lies ahead. And we will, as Frederick Engels wrote, either make a transition to socialism or barbarism. If we do not dismantle global capitalism, we will descend into the Hobbesian chaos of failed states, mass migrations, which we are already witnessing, and endless war. Populations, especially in the global south, will endure increased misery and high mortality rates caused by collapsing ecosystems and infrastructures on a scale not seen since perhaps the Black Plague. There can be no accommodation with global capitalism. We will overthrow this system. Let me repeat that word for Homeland Security. That's overthrow. We will overthrow this system or be crushed by it. And at this moment of crisis, we need to remind ourselves what being a socialist means and what it does not mean. First and foremost, all socialists are unequivocal anti-militarists and anti-imperialists. They understand that there is no genuine social, political, economic, or cultural reform as long as the militarists and their corporate allies in the war industry continue to loot and pillage the state budget leaving the poor to go hungry, working men and women in distress, and the infrastructure and social services to be neglected or slashed in the name of austerity. The psychosis of permanent war, which infect the body politic and has done so since after World War I, with the internal and external war on communism, and which today is mutated into the war on terror, is used by the state to strip us of civil liberties, redirect our resources to the war machine, and criminalize democratic dissent. We have squandered trillions of dollars and resources in endless and futile wars from Vietnam to the Middle East at a time of ecological and physical crisis. And the folly of endless war is one of the signs of a dying civilization. One F-22 Raptor fighter plane costs $350 million, and we have 187 of them. One Tomahawk cruise missile costs $1.41 million, and we fired 161 of them at Libya. And that attack alone cost us $250 million. We spend an estimated $1.7 trillion a year on war, far more than the official 54% of discretionary spending, or roughly $600 billion. And if we do not break the back of the war machine, profound change will be impossible. We have been at war almost continuously since the first Gulf War in 1991, followed by Somalia in 1992, Haiti in 1994, Bosnia in 1995, Serbia, Kosovo in 1999, Afghanistan in 2001, where we have now been fighting for 14 years, and Iraq in 2003. And we can toss in Yemen, Libya, Pakistan, and Syria, along with Israel's proxy war against the Palestinian people. The human cost has been horrendous. Over 1 million lives lost in Iraq. Millions more displaced or refugees. Iraq will never be reconstituted as a unified state. And it was our war industry that created the mess. We attacked a country that did not threaten us and had no intention of threatening its neighbors, and destroyed one of the most modern infrastructures in the Middle East. We brought not only terror and death, including the Shiite death squads that we armed and trained, but power outages, food shortages, and the collapse of basic services from garbage collection to sewer and water treatment. We dismantled Iraq's institutions, disbanded its security forces, threw its health service into crisis, and engineered massive poverty and unemployment. And out of the chaos rose insurgents, gangsters, kidnapping rings, jihadists, and rogue military groups, including our hired mercenaries. Gary Leop, in an article in Counterbunch titled, "How George W. Bush Destroyed the Temple of Baal," got it when he wrote, "Bush destroyed the law and order, which had permitted girls to walk to school heads uncovered in modern Western dress. He destroyed the freedom of physicians and other professionals to go about their work and caused masses of them to exit their country. He destroyed neighborhoods where residents were forced to flee for their lives. He destroyed the Christian community, which dropped from 1.5 million in 2001 to perhaps 200,000 a decade later. He destroyed the prevalent ideology of secularism and ushered in an era of bitterly contested sectarian rule. He destroyed the right to broadcast rock and roll music or sell liquor and DVDs. He destroyed the stability of Anbar province by sowing the chaos that allowed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi to establish, for the first time, an al-Qaeda branch in Iraq. He destroyed the stability of Syria when al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, now ISIL, retreated into that neighboring country during the surge of 2007. By creating power vacuums and generating new chapters and spin-offs of al-Qaeda, he destroyed the Yazidi communities and their freedom from genocide and slavery. By hatching the forerunner of ISIL, he destroyed the prospects for a peaceful Arab Spring in Syria 3 years after his presidency ended. Through his actions, he destroyed the border between Syria and Iraq. He destroyed the tomb of Jonah in Mosul. He destroyed 3,300-year-old monuments, the glorious art of the Assyrians in Nimrod. On August 23rd, while sitting in his home artist studio in Crawford, Texas, he destroyed the 2,000-year-old temple of Baal Shamim in Palmyra, Syria. The most complete structure in that gorgeous pearl of an ancient preserved city, a mix of Roman, Syrian, and Egyptian artistic influences, is now a pile of rubble. Foreign battlefields are laboratories for the architects of industrial slaughter. They perfect the tools of control and annihilation on the demonized and the destitute. But these tools eventually make their way back to the heart of empire. As the corporatists and the militarists disembowel our nation, rendering our manufacturing centers boarded-up wastelands and tossing out citizens into poverty and despair, the methods of subjugation, familiar to those on the outer reaches of empire, migrate back to us. Wholesale surveillance, indiscriminate use of lethal force in the streets of our cities against unarmed citizens, a stripping away of civil liberties, a dysfunctional court system, drones, arbitrary arrests, detention, and mass incarceration. The tyranny empire imposes on others, as Thucydides reminded us, it finally imposes on itself. Those who kill in our name abroad soon kill in our name at home. Democracy is snuffed out. As the German socialist Karl Liebknecht said during the First World War, the main enemy is at home, and we will destroy the engines of endless war and shut down the war profiteers, or we will become the next victims. Indeed, many in our marginal communities already are its victims. You cannot be a socialist and an imperialist. You cannot, as Bernie Sanders has done, support the Obama administration's wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen and be a socialist. You cannot, as Sanders has done, vote for every military appropriations bill, including every bill and resolution that empowers and sanctions Israel to carry out its slow-motion genocide of the Palestinian people, and be a socialist. And you cannot laud, as Sanders has done, military contractors because they bring jobs to your states. Sanders may have the rhetoric of inequality down, but he is a full-fledged member of the Democratic caucus, which kneels before the war industry and their lobbyists. No genuine grassroots movement will ever be born within the bowels of the Democratic Party establishment. Because none of these elected officials dare challenge any weapons systems, no matter how costly or redundant. And Sanders, like all elected officials, profits from this Faustian pact. The Vermont Democratic Party leadership, in return for his deference, has not supported any candidate to run against Sanders since 1990. Sanders endorses Democratic candidates no matter how much they push neoliberalism down our throats, including Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And Sanders carrying water for the Democrats is the primary obstacle to building a third party in Vermont itself. Now, there is a reason no establishment politician will say a word about the war industry. Because if you do, you end up like Ralph Nader, tossed into the political wilderness. Nader was not afraid to speak this truth. And it is in the wilderness, I'm afraid, that real socialists must, for the moment, reside. Socialists understand that if we do not dismantle the war industry, nothing, absolutely nothing will change. Indeed, things will only get worse. War is a business. Imperial wars seize natural resources on behalf of corporations and ensure the profits of the arms industry. And this is as true in Iraq as it was in our campaigns of genocide against Native Americans. As A. Philip Randolph said, it is only when it is impossible to profit from war that wars will be dramatically curtailed, if not stopped. No one is sitting in the boardroom of General Dynamics hoping for peace in the Middle East. No one in the Pentagon, especially the generals who build their careers by managing wars, prays for a cessation of conflict. War, wrapped in the cant of nationalism and the euphoria that comes with a giddy celebration of power and violence, is used by ruling elites to thwart and destroy the aspirations of working men and women and distract us from our own disempowerment. Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder, and that is war in a nutshell, said the 5-time socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs during World War I. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. Debs, who in 1912 received almost 1 million votes, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for saying this. I've been accused of obstructing the war, Debs said in court. I admit it. I abhor war. I would oppose war if I stood alone. Debs, who spent 32 months in prison until 1921, also delivered to many a socialist credo at his sentencing after being found guilty of violating the Espionage Act. Your Honor, he said, years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I say then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. The capitalist class and its doppelgangers in the military establishment have carried out what John Ralston Saul calls a coup d'etat in slow motion. The elites have used war as a safety valve for class conflict. For war, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, creates an artificial community of interest between the oligarchs and the poor, diverting the poor from their natural interests. The redirecting of national frustrations and emotions into the struggle against a common enemy, the cant of patriotism, the endemic racism that is the fuel of all ideologies that sustain war, the false bonding that comes with a sense of comradeship seduces many on the margins of society. They feel in wartime, for perhaps the first time, that they belong. They feel they have a place. They are offered the chance to be heroes. And off they march like sheep to the slaughter. By the time they found out, it is too late. Modern totalitarianism can integrate the masses so completely into the political structure through terror and propaganda that they become the architects of their own enslavement, Dwight MacDonald wrote. This does not make slavery less, but on the contrary more, a paradox there is no space to unravel here. Bureaucratic collectivism, not capitalism, is the most dangerous future enemy of socialism. War, as Randolph Bourne wrote, is the health of the state. It allows the state to accrue to itself power and resources that in peacetime a citizenry would never permit. And this is why the war state, like the one we live in, has to make certain that we are always afraid. Constant violence by the war machine, we are assured, will alone make us safe. Any attempt to rein in spending or expanding power will profit the enemy. It was the militarists and the capitalists at the end of World War II who conspired to roll back the gains made by working men and women under the New Deal. They used the rhetoric of the Cold War to cement into place an economy geared towards total war, even in peacetime. This permitted the arms industry to continue to make weapons with guaranteed profits from the state, and permitted the generals to continue to preside over their fiefdoms. The incestuous relations between the corporatists and the militarists see retired generals and officers offered lucrative jobs in the war industry once they retire. The manufacturing of weapon systems and the waging of war is today the chief activity of the state. It is no longer one among other means of advancing the national interest, but has become the sole national interest. And these corporatists and militarists are the enemy of all socialists. They bankrolled and promoted movements in the early 20th century that called for reforms within the structures of capitalism. These movements that spoke in the language of, quote, the politics of productivism, that eschewed the language of class conflict and talked only about economic growth and a partnership with the capitalist class. The NAACP, for example, was formed to lure African Americans away from the Communist Party, the only radical organization that in the early 20th century did not discriminate. The AFL-CIO was fed CIA money to help crush and supplant radical unions abroad and at home. The AFL-CIO, like the NAACP, is today a victim of its own corruption and bureaucratic senility. Its bloated leadership pulls down huge salaries as its dwindling rank and file is stripped of benefits and protections. And the capitalists no longer need what they once called responsible unionism, which meant pliable unionism. And once the capitalists and the militarists killed off the radical movements and unions, they finished off the dupes who had helped them do it. And that is why less than 12% of our country's workforce is unionized. It is why we have such vast income disparities and chronic unemployment and underemployment. Surplus labor, desperate for work, and unwilling to challenge the bosses in the hope that they will retain a job, is the bulwark of capitalism. The radicals, such as the industrial workers of the world, or Wobblies founded by Mother Jones and Big Bill Haywood in 1905, were destroyed by the state. Department of Justice agents in 1912 made simultaneous raids on 48 IWW meeting halls across the country and arrested 165 union leaders. 101 went to trial, including Big Bill Haywood, who testified for 3 days. One of the union leaders told this to the court. You ask me why the IWW is not patriotic to the United States. If you were a bum without a blanket, if you had left your wife and kids when you went west for a job and had never located them since, if your job had never kept you long enough in a place to qualify you to vote, if you slept in a lousy, sour bunkhouse and ate food just as rotten as they could give you and get by with, if deputy sheriffs shot your cooking cans full of holes and spilled your grub on the ground, if your wages were lowered on you when the bosses thought they had you down, if there was one law for Ford, Seward, and Mooney and another for Harry Thaw, if every person who represented law and order in the nation beat you up, railroaded you to jail, and the good Christian people cheered and told them to go do it, how in hell do you expect a man to be patriotic? The Wobblies once led strikes involving hundreds of thousands of workers and preached an uncompromising doctrine of class war. And the Wobblies went the way of the passenger pigeon. The Socialist Party in 1912 had 126,000 members, 1,200 office holders in 340 municipalities, and 29 English and 22 foreign language weeklies, along with 3 English and 6 foreign language dailies. It included in its ranks tenant farmers, garment workers, railroad workers, coal miners, hotel and restaurant workers, dock workers, and lumberjacks, and it too was liquidated by the state. Socialist leaders were jailed or deported. Socialist publications such as The Masses and Appeal to Reason were banned. And the assault, aided later by McCarthyism, has left us without the vocabulary to make sense of our own reality, to describe the class war being waged against us by our corporate oligarchs. And it has left us without the radical movements that, as Howard Zinn made clear, opened up all of the spaces in American democracy. We will regain this militancy, this uncompromising commitment to socialism, or the system the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. Will establish the most efficient security and surveillance state in human history and a species of neo-feudalism. And we must stop pouring our energy into mainstream political campaigns because the game is rigged. We will rebuild our radical movements, or we will become hostages to the capitalists and the masters of war. Fear is the only language the power elite understands. This is a dark fact of human nature. It is why Richard Nixon was our last liberal president. Nixon was not a liberal. He was devoid of empathy and lacked a conscience, but he was frightened of movements. And you do not make your enemy afraid by selling out. You make your enemy afraid by refusing to submit, by fighting for your vision, and by organizing. For it is not our job to take power. It is our job to build movements to keep power in check. You get freedom by letting your enemy know that you'll do anything to get your freedom, then you'll get it, Malcolm X said. When you get that kind of attitude, they'll label you as a crazy Negro, or they'll call you a crazy nigger. They don't say Negro. Or they'll call you an extremist, or a subversive, or seditious, or red, or radical. But when you stay radical long enough, and get enough people to be like you, you'll get your freedom. So don't you run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. Treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. And after you get your freedom, your enemy will respect you. And I say that with no hate. I don't have hate in me. I have no hate at all. I don't have hate. I've got some sense. I'm not going to let anybody who hates me tell me to love him. Malcolm X far more, I'm afraid, than Martin Luther King understood America. The New Deal, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a charter member of the oligarchic class, said saved capitalism, was put in place because socialists were strong and a threat. The oligarchs understood that with the breakdown of capitalism, something I expect we will witness in our own lifetimes, there was a real possibility of a revolution. They were terrified they would lose their wealth and power. Roosevelt, writing to a friend in 1930, said, "There was no question in my mind that it is time for the country to become fairly radical for at least one generation. History shows that when this occurs occasionally, nations are saved from revolution." In other words, Roosevelt went to his fellow oligarchs and said, "Hand over some of your money, or you will probably lose all of your money." And his fellow capitalists complied. And that is how the government created 15 million jobs, Social Security, unemployment benefits, and public works projects. The capitalists did not do this because the suffering of the masses moved them. They did this because they were scared. And they were scared of radicals and socialists. We must stop looking for our salvation in strong leaders. Strong people, as Ella Baker said, do not need strong leaders. Politicians, even good politicians, play the game of compromise and are too often seduced by the privileges of power. Sanders, from all I can tell, began his political life as a socialist in the 60s, when this was hardly a bold political statement, but quickly figured out that he was not going to have a seat at the table if he remained one. He wants his seniority in the Senate. He wants his committee chairmanships. He wants his ability to retain his Senate seat unchallenged. And no doubt this was politically astute. But in the process, he sold us out. Jeremy Corbyn, the new head of the Labour Party, offers another example. He spent 3 decades marginalized, even within his own party, because he held fast to the central tenets of socialism. And as the lie of neoliberalism, championed by the 2 ruling parties in Britain, became apparent, people knew whom they could trust. Corbyn never made an astute career move in his life, and that is why the establishment is so frightened of him. They know they cannot buy Corbyn off, any more than you could buy off Mother Jones, Emma Goldman, or Big Bill Haywood. Integrity and courage are powerful weapons, and we have to learn how to use them. We have to stand up for what we believe in, and we have to accept the risks and even the ridicule that comes with this stance. We will not prevail any other way. As a socialist, I am not concerned with what is expedient or what is popular. I am concerned with what is right. I am concerned with holding fast to the core ideals of socialism, if for no other reason than keeping this option alive for future generations. And these ideals are the only ones that will make possible a better world. If you will not call for an arms embargo, along with a boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, you are not a socialist. If you will not demand we dismantle our military establishment, which after all is managing the government's wholesale surveillance of every citizen and storing all our personal information in perpetuity in government computer banks. And if you will not abolish the for-profit arms industry, you are not a socialist. If you will not call for the prosecution of those leaders, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama, to engage in aggressive acts of preemptive war, which under post-Nuremberg laws is a crime of aggression, you are not a socialist. If you will not stand with all of the oppressed across the globe, you are not a socialist. Socialists do not pick and choose whom among the oppressed it is convenient to support. Socialists understand that you stand with all of the oppressed or none of the oppressed, that this is a global fight for life against global corporate tyranny. And we will only win when we stand together with the working men and women in Greece, Spain, Egypt, and every other country that has defined the tyranny of global capitalism. If you will not call for full employment and unionized workplaces, you are not a socialist. If you will not call for inexpensive mass transit, especially in impoverished communities, you are not a socialist. If you will not call for universal single-payer health care and a banning of the for-profit health care corporations, you are not a socialist. If you will not raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, you are not a socialist. If you are not willing to provide a weekly income of $600 to the unemployed, the disabled, stay-at-home parents, the elderly, and those unable to work, you are not a socialist. If you will not repeal anti-union laws like the Taft-Hartley Act and trade agreements from NAFTA to the TPP and CAFTA, you are not a socialist. If you will not support 2 years of paid maternity leave, as well as shorter work weeks with no loss in pay and benefits, you are not a socialist. If you will not repeal the Patriot Act in Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, as well as end government spying on citizens, along with mass incarceration, you are not a socialist. If you will not put into place laws that prohibit all forms of male violence against women and criminalize the trafficking and pimping out of prostituted girls and women while not criminalizing the exploited girls and women, you are not a socialist. If you do not support a woman's right to control her own body, you are not a socialist. If you do not support full equality for GBLT community, you are not a socialist. If you do not declare global warming a national and global emergency and devote our energy and resources to saving the planet through public investment in renewable energy and an end to our reliance on fossil fuels, you are not a socialist. If you will not nationalize all public utilities, including the railroads, energy companies, and the banks, you are not a socialist. If you will not support government funding for the arts and public broadcasting to create places where creativity, self-expression, and voices of dissent can be heard and seen, you are not a socialist. If you will not terminate our nuclear weapons program and build a nuclear-free world, you are not a socialist. If you will not demilitarize our police, and this means that police no longer carry weapons when they patrol our streets. They must rely on specialized units that have to be specially authorized case by case to use lethal force, and if you don't do this, you are not a socialist. If you will not support government training and rehabilitation programs for the poor and those in our prison system, along with the abolition of the death penalty, you are not a socialist. If you will not grant full citizenship to undocumented workers, you are not a socialist. If you will not declare a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, you are not a socialist. If you will not provide free, state-run mental health care, especially for those caged in our prisons, you are not a socialist. If you will not provide government-funded education from daycare to university and forgive all student debt, you are not a socialist. And finally, if you will not dismantle our empire and bring our soldiers and Marines home, you are not a socialist. Socialists do not sacrifice the weak and the vulnerable, especially children, on the altar of profit. And the measure of a successful society for a socialist is not the GDP or the highs of the stock market, but the right of everyone, especially children, never to go to bed hungry, to live in safety and security, to be nurtured and educated, and to grow up to fulfill his or her potential. I am not naive about the forces arrayed against us. I understand the difficulty of our struggle. But we will never succeed if we attempt to accommodate the current structures of power. Our strength lies in our steadfastness and our integrity. It lies in our ability to hold fast to our ideals, as well as our willingness to sacrifice for those ideals. We must refuse to cooperate. We must march to the beat of a different drum. We must rebel. And we must grasp that rebellion is not carried out finally for what it achieves, but for who it allows us to become.
Yes.
Rebellion sustains us in an age of darkness. It provides hope and the capacity for love. And rebellion must become our vocation. You do not become a dissident just because you decide one day to take up this most unusual career, Václav Havel said when he was battling the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. You are thrown into it by your personal sense of responsibility, combined with a complex set of external circumstances. You are cast out of the existing structures and placed in a position of conflict with them. It begins as an attempt to do your work well and ends with being branded an enemy of society. The dissident does not operate in the realm of genuine power at all. He or she is not seeking power. He or she has no desire for office and does not gather votes. He or she does not attempt to charm the public. He or she offers nothing and promises nothing. He or she can offer, if anything, only their own skin. And you offer it solely because you have no other way of affirming the truth you stand for. The dissident's actions simply articulate his dignity as a citizen, regardless of the cost. These neoliberal forces are destroying our Earth. Polar ice caps and glaciers are melting. Temperatures and sea levels are rising. Species are going extinct. Floods, monster hurricanes, mega droughts, wildfires have begun to eat away at the systems that sustain life. The great mass migrations predicted by climate scientists have begun. And even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, we would still endure the effects of catastrophic climate change. Out of the disintegrating order comes nihilistic violence, which characterizes all societies that fall apart. Mass shootings at home, religious persecution, beheadings, executions by individuals that neoliberalism and globalism has demonized, attacked, and discarded as human refuse. I cannot promise you we will win. I cannot promise you we will even survive as a species. But I can promise you that an open and sustained defiance of global capitalism and the merchants of death, along with the building of a socialist movement, is our only hope. I am a parent, as are many of you, and we have betrayed our children. We have squandered their future. And if we rise up, even if we fail, future generations, and especially those who are most precious to us, will at least be able to say that we tried, that we stood up, that we fought for life. The call to resistance, which will require civil disobedience and jail time, is finally a call to the moral life. In the end, I do not fight fascists because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. Thank you.
There are just shy of 500 people in this room tonight, so you'll need to practice some socialist trust and empathy that someone also wants to ask Mr. Hedges, excuse me, Mr. Mr. Hedge, I think I did. Mr. Hedges, a question. To that end, please stand up and offer it very loud so that we don't have to return it, and make it short. I'm also asked to, by way of inspiration, suggest some coffee, which is for sale over there, and there are some tickets available for a small reception after this event if you'd like to take advantage of that opportunity. Questions, please.
I'm standing up and I'm loud.
Okay, go ahead.
When will you run for Senate as a career?
I don't want to run. I don't want to run because it's not my role. I first of all don't want to go around and sleep on people's couches and have to address. I just don't want to do it. But second of all, I oftentimes say things that are not. I don't ever want to get in front of a crowd and want them to like me or to appeal to them. As an intellectual, that's death. I was very critical, as some of you know, of the Black Bloc, anarchists during Occupy, for which I took quite a bit of heat. And I remember speaking to Occupy activists, many of whom were not Black Bloc, who were upset. And I said, look, the moment I need your adulation, I'm finished. And I have taken heat for taking, even among the left, unpopular positions against prostitution, against pornography, calling the left out on this. I usually do not get a warm reception when I go after Bernie Sanders. In 2008, I was Nader's speechwriter, and I was calling Obama out. I remember I was booed in Berkeley. And I think that that's my role. And that if I were to attempt to actually run for office and was trying to entice a crowd, I would not, maybe even unconsciously, deliver the kind of honesty that, for me, is at the core of what I do as a writer and an intellectual.
Professor, what is the relationship between the new socialism versus Bolivia, Venezuela, and other nations that have the same model of politics?
Right. Well, he's asking the relationship between the socialism in Bolivia and Venezuela. I used to live in Bolivia. I don't know where you're from, but... Peru. Okay, I lived in Miraflores, I'm ashamed to say, but yes. I lived for 6 years in Latin America. I studied Spanish in Cochabamba. I mean, the great thing about Morales and Bolivia is that it's not only socialism, but it is a return of indigenous culture and a celebration of indigenous culture and indigenous values. And that's something that, Euro-Americans are going to swiftly have to get in touch with. Because when we went out west and, used the U.S. military on behalf of the railroad barons and the cattle ranchers and the prospectors and the timber merchants to slaughter indigenous people in this country, it wasn't just about taking their land and carrying out acts of genocide. It was about destroying a competing ethic with capitalism. Because as in an indigenous culture, if you hoard everything for yourself, you are detested, like Donald Trump. Yeah. Indigenous cultures have a sense of the sacred, which, we need to recover. And so I think that we in the United States need to look at what's happening in Bolivia, what's happening in Venezuela, what's happened in Greece, what's happening with Podemos in Spain, because they're way ahead of us. And we have to learn both ideologically and tactically from their experience. Because if we don't break the back of the American war machine and corporate capitalism in the heart of empire, everybody's screwed. We have a special responsibility to stand up for what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth.
Following on that exact thought, breaking the back of the corporate state and the militaristic state, for everyday citizens, how? Where do we begin?
Well, I mean, acts of civil disobedience against drone operators. We have seen in Britain where activists have blocked trains that carry nuclear weapons. I mean, it's going to be civil disobedience on a big level. And going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government. I don't like it in there, but we really don't have any. I was speaking to some mothers from Anaheim and Orange County, all of whom's sons have been murdered by police officers in this county. It was just an incredibly moving and painful meeting before this event. And I said, look, you all got to buy tickets to Disneyland, and we've all got to go into Disneyland with the names of one of these murdered youth and have a die-in, and when you organize it, call me up and I'll be there.
Thank you. We know that by 2050, there's going to be no more white majority in this country. As a prior sovereign, Mexican American, indigenous descent person, we are the minority, especially here in California, probably the majority period. The question is, what do you feel about whites? Because you said that you haven't been in contact with us, standing back and pushing forward Mexican Americans or any person of color.
Well, he's asking about as people of color become the majority within the United States. I mean, that white minority, and white supremacy, although we have a black president or biracial president, is flourishing, as any African American in our sacrifice zones or Latino knows. Organize, organize, organize. Stop believing the lies of politicians, even Latino politicians. Don't trust politicians. Even if they're good. And that is the failure of the left. That, as I said in my talk, it's not our job to take power. It's our job to make the powerful frightened of us. So it's 1971. There's a gigantic anti-war demonstration outside the White House. Richard Nixon has taken empty city buses and put them end to end as barricades around the White House. And in Kissinger's memoirs, nobody should buy the book. They're standing at the window, and Nixon's going, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's where we want people in power to be. Malcolm X understood this in a way that King did not until late in his life. Malcolm understood this.
First, I want to thank you on your stance for the Palestinians. How do you feel about the BDS movement?
Oh, I was just disinvited at the University of Pennsylvania because I fully support the BDS movement. And I was just in Washington 3 days ago meeting with 300 BDS activists from all around the country. And I said, this is the work. Forget about going to your congressman. Forget about writing letters. School by school, institution by institution, church by church, we're going to break them just like we broke the apartheid regime in South Africa.
My question is, I know you mentioned something about the process of obtaining power in office is not important, but I think how you feel about the local level, such as, city council members to Shama.
Right. Last night I was in Oakland helping Shama raise money. But the thing about Shama is that she's not an individual. She comes out of socialist alternative. And that's the point. that we can have a political expression of our movements, the way Syriza does in Greece or Podemos does in Spain, but it's useless if we don't have the movements. And the energy and the time and the importance of, should go into the movement itself. And so that, even sympathetic political leaders must feel that kind of heat and that kind of pressure. I support Shama, and I've supported Jill and previously supported Nader, but it's movements. If we don't have the movements, it almost doesn't matter, because the system is configured in such a way that power has been wrested from us. And even, I knew Dennis Kucinich when he was in the House. He wasn't, unlike Bernie Sanders, Kucinich was not allowed to sit in the Democratic caucus. I mean, the Democratic establishment treated him as if he had leprosy. And Kucinich and I stood on outside the Cannon building calling for George W. Bush's impeachment, and Bernie Sanders was nowhere to be seen. Let's get, go ahead.
How do we go about getting real information told through the traditional media means? I, for example, am a community college teacher, and I know that I have increasing numbers of homeless students. How do we get the truth out when the public figures are not?
Yeah, she's asking about how to get the truth out when, you're right. The public figures are a lie. Unemployment figures, as Jill mentioned, are a lie. Inflation is a lie. They just keep juggling around the consumer items they measure to make it about 3% because it's what the banks want. Just about everything we're fed now is a lie. And how do we get it out? There are some writers, Glenn Greenwald, Jeremy Scale, Amy Goodman, who still do journalism. But you're right, it's hard, and we're saturated with, part of it is I build walls. I don't own a television. I remain rooted in a print-based culture, so the only rooms in my house that don't have bookshelves are the kitchen and the bathrooms. I have 5,000 plus books, and I read every single night, at least 2 to 3 hours, because I don't want to speak even in the language that they give me. And I think I'm a great believer that we have to recover the voices of those who went before us. Gramsci, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, the most important intellectual in American history, James Baldwin, who Orwell is my hero, Baldwin and Orwell. And I worry that they've struggled, they've thought, they've fought. That's who we come from, and we have to reconnect with them, and we're only going to do it through print. Ideas, if you really want to understand capitalism, to be honest, I've never finished it, but you have to read Marx's Capitalism, a bit like Don Quixote, which probably nobody's ever really read except Cervantes. But you need to know Marx to understand. Marx has the most astute understanding of capitalism and how it works. And you're not going to get it in a soundbite. So I'm a great believer in, severing your connection with your electronic hallucinations and reading. What's what?
What would you like to see the students do?
Well, the students. They've kind of been sold down the river. I've always said at campuses that I would find 10 students who had $100,000 in debt, that's $1 million, and I would go chain yourself to the president's office with a big sign saying how much money they make you owe. The problem is the students tend to buy into the lie, you know, keep borrowing the money, and they have a, you know, these institutions have a vested interest in perpetuating the lie. So it's only when you get out and then you're like disconnected and you don't have a community that you realize you've been utterly betrayed. So, you know, I think we've got to recover that political consciousness on the campuses, where you can find a hall to meet, where you can carry out acts of civil disobedience, because once you're tossed out, you know, you're living in your parents' basement trying to pay $700 a month. And that's just where they want you to be. Debt peonage, as any African American will tell you, is a very effective form of social control. Go ahead.
So in American culture, we tend to hold in high esteem the founding fathers, hypocritical slave owners as they were. They had a constitutional convention to create a new government system. We know that there needs to be an economic change, but do you believe that there should be any changes in the way we elect our leaders and the way the government fundamentally functions? Do we need a new constitutional convention?
Well, the Constitutional Convention was a coup d'etat on the part of a slaveholding oligarchic elite, in which radicals like Thomas Paine, and even to an extent Jefferson, although he was a slaveholder, were pushed aside. The American system, I teach in a prison. I don't know if you know that. I've been teaching in prisons for a long time. It's a funny thing to teach in a prison. I've taught at Princeton and Columbia and a few other places. But when you teach in a prison, you have to write a course description which looks absolutely as boring and innocuous as possible, which is exactly the opposite of a course catalog. I remember once I was teaching at Columbia, and it was a spring day, and my class said, "Oh, please, can't we have like class on the lawn?" I never do this. I finally, like in a moment of weakness, took my class out, and they're all sitting on the lawn. And one of the students goes, "Look, it's Henry Kissinger." I said, "All right, inside, everybody forget it, no more class." But I wrote up a course description for the prison that I was going to teach an introduction to American history, the three branches of government, our founding fathers, the Constitution, which they approved, and then I gave all of my students Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. And I would be giving my 90-minute lectures on Zinn, and I would hear my students go, I mean, literally, they would say, they go, "Damn, we've been lied to." But Zinn understood, that book's very important, because Zinn understood that the system from the start was gamed by white male slaveholding oligarchs. So they disenfranchised women, they disenfranchised African Americans, they disenfranchised Native Americans, they disenfranchised men without property. Then they created the Electoral College, just in case we might vote for somebody they don't want. Then they created the Senate, senators were all appointed. So, as Zinn points out in that book, every opening in American history was paid for by the blood of working men and women. Every opening. And we had the bloodiest labor wars of any country in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered, thousands were injured, tens of thousands were blacklisted. And none of these movements achieved power. The Liberty Party didn't achieve power, or the suffragettes didn't achieve power. The Wobblies didn't achieve power, but they created the opening for the rest of us. And that's Zinn's great contribution. And that we have to recover that dynamism and that radicalism and that commitment, because now that they've abolished our organizations, we are being ruthlessly stripped. Obama's assault on civil liberties is worse than Bush. So we have to step outside the system and invest our energy in building radical organizations that scare the shit out of them.
Could you talk a little bit about fear, courage, and dissidence?
Well, if you haven't noticed, the state spends billions of dollars a year to make you scared. I was in Amtrak station the other day, and they were looping a video. If you see something, say so, whatever it was, and they actually showed some sort of, somebody who was supposed to be a dodgy character getting cuffed on the video and taken away. That's what they're doing to Corbyn, by the way. That's how they'll attack Corbyn, by saying he's going to make us unsafe. And that's what tyrants always do. They justify the destruction of civil liberties, the squandering of national resources, and the unlimited power of the military and the security and surveillance state by promising to make us safe, when in fact all of the actions that they carry out, especially the demonization of Muslims, make our situation far more dangerous. I mean, ISIS has 20,000 foreign jihadists. Why? Because of the racism in France, the racism in Britain, because there are no jobs, because they're stuck out in banlieues with, terrorized by the French police the way Latinos and poor African Americans are terrorized in this country. When you brutalize people long enough, they become brutal. So you have ISIS captures a Jordanian pilot, puts him in a cage and burns him. What we don't see is all of the families we incinerate day after day after day. Now, what they did was brutal, but it was morally the same. And that's the problem. If we don't understand the consequence of our brutality, there's always blowback. And we see the explosion, the rage. What we don't see is the long, slow drip of collective humiliation, abuse, violence. And we can go a few blocks from here and I can show you examples of this. And we better wake up to what this neoliberal order is doing in our name. But in fact, the neoliberals love it. If they didn't have ISIS, they'd probably create ISIS. I mean, to an extent, they did create ISIS. And they, it's like 1984 with, who was the great figure of hate? I can't remember the name. Anybody remember? I should patrol. What? No, Orwell wrote it, but it was like a night on the weekly. What was it? Goldstein. Yeah, right, Goldstein. So, I mean, it was like kind of that with Osama bin Laden. And then when he was gone, we got, Zarqawi. And when he was gone, we got Baghdadi. I mean, there's always like the figure of... And it's kind of raw in America. I mean, if you look closely, it's just saturates, and the media is like a giant echo chamber. The media has been distressingly bought off. Do you know who Wolf Blitzer used to work for before he worked for CNN? Anyone know? Pat Robertson. Yeah. Not only that, he was Pat Robertson's correspondent in Jerusalem. Now there's where Wolf Blitzer learned his journalism.
But Mr. Fuller had a quote, if you want to change something, you build a better model.
Right.
And in your travels, could you please share some of the things that you've seen that people on the community level are building the commons? Because I think that's part of your message.
Yeah, it is, very much. I mean, the more, anywhere you go where people begin to build, local food, any way that you can sever yourself from the tentacles of corporate power, the more you do it, the more freedom you have. And that's why, by the way, the agribusiness, I'm a vegan. And I'm a vegan because the animal agriculture industry is maybe surpasses the fossil fuel industry in terms of destroying the planet. And you can wake up tomorrow and be a vegan. I just had lunch at your vegan restaurant right here. It's fine. So, that's a little and big. But that's something we can all do. And, you're enduring this drought. It takes 1,000 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of milk. And milk's not even good for you. It's made for cows. It's not made for people. It's made for baby cows, who we kill. That's another story.
I'd appreciate your thoughts on how we respond to the simplistic refutal, the simplistic arguments that are thrown back in our faces when people say, if you're against this, you don't support the troops, you hate freedom. They're at a level of about 5th graders, for God's sakes. I'll meet you out by the bike rack, you know? They're such simpletons, but it is almost made to get under your skin. And
well, it's hard. I mean, you know, what's interesting is that the one time that I received, you know, sustained daily death threats was when I denounced Bush's call to invade Iraq. And I would come into my office at the New York Times, and the whole phone bank, the message bank, was full. And what surprised me was the anger, the rage. And I think that's because, and I quoted Du Bois, who you should go read on this, but he's right, Du Bois, that you take these people who've been, you know, hammered, pushed aside, dead-end jobs if they have jobs, you know, kind of hopeless, and you give them the war. And the war says, first of all, we're all Americans. And second of all, look at our missiles, because if you really look at the war coverage, it's all about like how powerful our weapons are. Look at how powerful they are, and you're kind of powerful. And if you go to a baseball game, you know you can't, like, you don't have the skills to, but they've got all those big jumbotrons. You can be a hero too. You know, they do it well. And so if you challenge that narrative, you're challenging more than a false narrative. You're pushing these people into an existential crisis, because that's all the state has given them. I mean, if they get over there and they get in combat, they realize it's a lie, and they've been used. And, you know, that's why suicide rates are so astronomical among combat veterans. Because when they come back, they realize how they've been used. They realize that every institution, the church, the media, the government, Hollywood, all lied to them. But I think we have to understand that what's driving this is not only the easy cliches and the idiocy that's fed to them by the mass media, but something deeper and more painful. And they fear that if that's taken away from them, they have nothing left. And that's why the only way that we will break the back of, you know, these kind of proto-fascist movements is by reintegrating them into the economy, where they will have jobs. And jobs are not about work, finally, alone. They're about dignity, self-respect. And if we reintegrate them into the economy, then in essence we give them hope. And not a real hope rather than a false hope. But trying to argue with them, I mean, I took on the Christian right a few years ago. I wrote a book called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I was trying to reach out to them. And you know, if people deny your legitimate right to be, which these groups often do, then there's no dialogue. Any dialogue begins from the recognition of the right of the other to be. So I was speaking in Pasadena at All Saints, which has a large gay community, and several GBLT people came to me and said, well, how do we deal with even members of our family who say, you know, we love the sinner, we hate the sin, you're sick, you know, you have to. I said, well, do you know the American expression, fuck you?
And we waiting for you to come to Orange County this week. We even sent you a little PowerPoint slideshow. This is our movement. We need you here because we are seeing when we're talking about commons, one of the things that we feel like is that the dialogue is not happening enough in Orange County. And Orange County, it feels like we're in this, on an island here. And as we've been working in the community and doing work that is resistance work within our communities, at the same time, the progressives within the greater Orange County, which we saw many people come out, about 2,000 people to Irvine during that march. And the thing is, we're trying to keep a sustained dialogue by bringing people like you to come and speak. And we had Richard Wolf, which Patrick Conlon, and a small group of people just keep on pushing on this thing. And then we have wonderful people like the Green Party to help sponsor it. But the thing I'm asking is, how, from your syndicate, can people start to say we have to stop in Orange County because we need you, and we're a young group of people that are, we need this dialogue to continue, and we need it to grow stronger here.
Well, I just made a promise to go to Anaheim. I never in my life thought I would buy a ticket to Disneyland, but I will for this one. Maybe I'll wear my clerical collar. What's that?
Can I ask a follow-up quickly?
Well, yeah, but let's just make sure that everyone else who hasn't asked gets a chance.
I'm sorry. So the LGBT community recently had a huge victory with marriage equality, but some of my transgender friends have voiced concerns that our community is going to become complacent.
Right.
And I remember all over social media there was this picture. It was the gay agenda, and at the top of the list it had marriage equality checked off. And then the rest of it was just mundane bullshit, like go buy new shoes, or do groceries. And there's so much, it was upsetting because there's still so much more to do. And so I want to ask you, how do we keep the momentum moving forward toward equality for everyone?
Well, I would argue that the rights of GBLT people in this country have gotten worse. In urban settings, for GBLT people with disposable incomes, they can worry about shoes. But if you're a GBLT person in a small town in Arkansas, you're going to end up like Matthew Shepard. And my frustration with the leadership of the GBLT community is they sold out their brothers and sisters who were poor. And the GBLT community, I think, especially when you look at these enclaves where communities are dominated by megachurches, needs to get in touch with the suffering of their own, and then build bridges with others who are oppressed. And I'm a great friend of Mel White. Mel married me and my wife on a beach on Fire Island at dawn. I called Mel up. I said, I don't know many Christians in this country, so you and your partner got to get on a train. They were living in Lynchville. Gary, come on up. And Mel, who I admire very much, wrote a great book, Stranger at the Gate, his own struggle. He was in the fundamentalist movement, struggling with quote-unquote same-sex attraction, eventually tried to kill himself. But Mel will go to the steps of those megachurches where kids have died and hold memorial services for them on the steps and then turn and accuse the church of murder. And I think I think you touched on something very important, that it's always complacent for, and you've seen this in the African American community, that's why Sharpton and Jesse Jackson were booed out of Ferguson, because they were seduced into an accommodationist attitude with powers of white supremacy and corporatism that benefited them personally. But, certainly in African American or Latino communities, you can argue that in marginal communities that life is worse than when King marched in Selma. And any movement will derive both its integrity and its strength from its commitment to the most vulnerable. And when you turn your backs on the most vulnerable, then you become narcissists. And you self-destruct. Narcissism, Narcissus looked at a pool of water and couldn't turn away until he died. The Greeks kind of got it all. I think they're telling me I have to stop. I'll go all night, but...
Unite the 99 and the 1%?
No. We can unite when we put handcuffs on them. I'm actually against mass incarceration. I haven't quite figured out what to do with Lloyd Blankfein myself. Look, that goes to that Malcolm X quote. There are people who do not have our interests or the interests of our children at heart and are willing to destroy us and our children for greed. I listen to Obama talk about education. We need to raise the education. I'm thinking, the people who screwed us over were the best educated people in the country. It's not about education, it's about greed. That's Larry Summers. I went to a very elite boarding school at the age of 10, unfortunately, on scholarship. So I grew up with these people. So I know how venal they are. I've been in their homes where, children of 11 or 12 are ordering around their servants. I know their sense of entitlement, their racism, their utter lack of empathy, and the way they build cocoons around themselves. These kinds of people which exist in any society have to be held in check. And unfortunately, we live in a society where they have absolutely unfettered and absolute power. And they are killing us. In theological terms, these corporations, BP, they're forces of death. That's not over-dramatizing. They will destroy the ecosystem on which we depend for life. And Obama is completely complicit in this.
It's not their fault that they were in a cocoon, too, so wouldn't it be easier with them than against them?
You mean with the 1%?
Because they already have the infrastructure and the power already. We built it!
Right.
It creates the divide already, and we're already saying that we are together.
No, they created the divide.
Yeah, I know.
We didn't create the divide. They made war against us. We didn't make war against them.
That's true.
These people destroyed our democracy.
I know.
They destroyed our economy. They're destroying the environment. They're murdering people all over the globe with militarized drones and cruise missiles. We're talking about criminals here.
I agree. I agree with all of that. But it's like a crystal Christmas kind of thing or whatever. I don't know. It's just this paradoxical.
Well, evil's real. Evil is real. Evil's real.
We can't do it without their power at the same time.
You know what? I covered the breakdown of the Stasi state in East Germany. I was there, and the Stasi state, until our own, was the most sophisticated security and surveillance state in the world. And what happened, a bunch of dopey Lutherans in Leipzig on like Tuesday nights would have candlelit vigils and march through the streets of Leipzig. And everybody laughed at them, just like they probably laugh at the anti-war activists who, protest the war in a street corner in, Santa Ana. And then what happened? Suddenly people started to join them. And suddenly there were 70,000 people marching through the streets of Leipzig. And what did Erich Honecker do? He sent down an elite paratroop division and said, shoot them. Shoot the motherfuckers. And you know what the elite paratroop division did? They put down their weapons. And Erich Honecker was out. That's how revolution works. Revolutions are nonviolent. The Russian Revolution was nonviolent. The Cossacks were sent in to crush the Petrograd bread riots, and they refused to fire on the crowd, and even before he can get back to St. Petersburg, the Tsar abdicates. Iran, the fifth largest military in the world at the time, the Shah flees, and the military says it's over. We're not. Same with Somoza. Same in Cuba. And the thing is, when you stand up to despotic power and you name truth, this is Václav Havel's 1978 essay, Living in Truth, which you should all read. Yes. When you live in truth, which is really all I've been saying, you speak to people within the centers of power, and they hear it. And when you're willing nonviolently to put your body on the line, there will be segments within those centers of power who will shoot you, but there will be other segments that won't, and that creates paralysis. So I learned a very important lesson. I was in the Occupy movement, and I was giving a talk in Zuccotti, and it was on YouTube, somebody filmed it, and I was saying, stop taunting the police. I'm not defending what the police do, but stop taunting them. And I said, most of the, actual physical assaults are carried out by the white-shirted officers. And in the video I said, look, we only have to live with the white-shirted assholes an hour or two a day. They have to live with them all day long. So I was giving a talk in New York a few months later, and a man came up to me, and he said, I'm a white-shirted asshole, and I read all of your books. And I read King. I realized I'd made a mistake. I should not have said that, even if he's the only one. I mean, I'm going to tell something I probably shouldn't, but as you might imagine, I have periodic problems with the Department of Corrections of the state of New Jersey. And, last semester I taught The Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. So I gave my class the syllabus, and there was a Wednesday when I was speaking in Montana. I said I won't be here. And I'm in my hotel room in Montana, and I get a phone call on my cell phone. And it says, this is the Special Investigations Division of the Department of Corrections of the state of New Jersey. Do you know that your class just led a sit-down strike in our prison? And it was really moving, because if anybody knows what the prison authorities are going to do to them, which they did, it's them. I can't remember why I'm telling you this story. What was the question? Anyway, I got signed. What?
Working with the 1%.
Oh, yeah, right, working with the 1%. So they said, we're banning you from the prison. And you have to come in and speak to us, which is called an interrogation. So, unfortunately, for the Special Investigations Division of the Department of Corrections of New Jersey, as a war correspondent, I have been interrogated by stupid cops all over the world all of my life. And they all climb out of the same rat hole. And the secret is, you are dumber than the cop. And I was the dumbest white guy you ever saw. And I got back in the prison, And it was very moving because you realize the stress that prisoners live under. They had all had their cells stripped. The 2 ringleaders had been found and shipped off to a prison in Southwoods, which is in southern New Jersey, which might as well be Mississippi. All the guards are white. They're white Aryans. They're KKK. Of course, the people who are shipped there are all black. We had just a few weeks ago, a 28-year-old prisoner was beaten to death. They gave his body to his family. They said he died of a heart attack. They said, we want an autopsy. They said, you want an autopsy? It's $4,000, which they didn't have. So, but what happened was that I found out that there were, I'm not going to name them, but there were people within the system who covered for me in the same way that that cop did. And I was back in. And that is something that terrifies the power elite. I mean, let's be clear about the people who oppose us. They use lethal force against us. We do not use lethal force against them. And that is a huge dividing line. And when you talk, you can't ask young African American or Latino people who are being gunned down in the streets in this county to build an alliance with their murderers. That's just not fair. Those murderers have to be stripped of their weapons, and that kind of activity by the state has to be banished. And it will only be banished when we rise up in a revolutionary movement and take back our country from the corporations that have seized it. You know, I was a war correspondent. I covered conflicts around the globe for 20 years. I have, as you might imagine, a very dark view of human nature. I know what human beings, you know, the wrong human beings are capable of doing. I know how easily people can be